It was just past midnight when Kenji boarded the last train from Shinjuku, shoulders heavy from another soul-crushing day at work, the air outside bitter with November wind, and the city behind him buzzing with neon lights he was too tired to care about. The platform was nearly empty, and as the train doors slid shut with a hiss that sounded almost like a whisper, he noticed there were only two others in the dimly lit car. An elderly woman with long, tangled gray hair, who sat motionless at the far end, clutching a worn handbag like it held her life inside, and a man in a black conductor's uniform, two cars ahead who stood perfectly still, facing the front as though waiting for a signal that would never come, his silhouette frozen like a shadow pinned to time. Kenji didn't think much of it at first. Just the usual odd late-night passengers, until he looked out the window and saw that the stations they were passing were wrong. Not just unfamiliar, but wrong. The names smeared in soot, the lights flickering like they hadn't been maintained in decades, and one station, he swore, had no floor at all. Just a black pit where the platform should have been. When he turned to check if anyone else noticed, the old woman was staring at him now with wide, glassy eyes, her mouth slightly open like she was about to speak but had forgotten how. And then, in a voice so thin and dry it barely moved the air, she said, "Don't speak to the conductor. He's not supposed to be here." And before Kenji could ask what she meant, the lights in the car flickered once, twice, then went out completely for 3 full seconds, and in that darkness, he heard footsteps, slow, heavy ones, walking down the train car toward him, not running, not hurrying, just coming. When the lights came back, the conductor was gone. The old woman had turned away again, and now the train was in a tunnel that didn't end, a black void stretching on and on outside the windows like the world had vanished, and his phone had no signal, no time, no battery, just a dead screen even though he remembered charging it before leaving work. Panic set in slowly, like cold water rising in his chest, as he tried to move to another car, but found every connecting door locked, sealed shut with rusted chains and red tags covered in kanji. He couldn't read, symbols that seemed to crawl when he looked at them too long, and the train just kept moving. Faster now, the sound of the rails gone, replaced by something deeper, like breathing, like metal grinding inside bone, like the whole train was alive and dreaming, and he was trapped inside it. Eventually, he tried to speak to the old woman again, but she was gone too, her seat empty except for her handbag, which was open and full of dust, and a single human tooth. When the train finally slowed, it wasn't at a real station but something else. Something impossible. A platform lit by candles where dozens of people stood completely still, facing the train, all dressed in funeral clothes, all with sacks over their heads tied with rope. And as the doors opened with a sigh that felt like death itself, none of them moved. But he could feel them looking at him, feel their hollow stares crawling under his skin. And when he turned to run, the conductor was suddenly there, standing in the aisle just a few steps away, holding out an old leather ticket puncher. Only it wasn't in his hand, because he didn't have hands, just long black fingers with claws like nails from a coffin. And when Kenji finally saw the conductor's face, he knew his mind would never hold together again, because there was no face, just a void. A hole where light was swallowed and memories vanished. And from that hole came a sound like everyone he'd ever known screaming underwater. In blind terror, Kenji threw himself through a window that shattered too easily, landing hard on steel tracks in a place that wasn't the tunnel anymore. It was a pit, a place beneath even hell, where the train sounds echoed forever and eyes blinked from the shadows in the walls. But somehow, he crawled and crawled and crawled until light touched his face, and he was found on the side of a road 2 days later, muttering about a train that eats people's names and a conductor that steals your soul through your eyes, his legs broken, his eyes bloodshot, and his mind shattered, repeating over and over to the paramedics. It's still coming. It never stops. It knows your name now. It was just another normal Tuesday morning when Eli, a subway maintenance worker in New York City, arrived at the control office in Grand Central Terminal, sipping cheap gas station coffee and yawning as he waited for his assignment, expecting something boring like fixing a loose panel or checking flickering lights. But his supervisor, a quiet, pale man named Marlowe, who rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, handed him a folded piece of paper and said, "You've been cleared for track 0. Something's moving down there." And though Eli blinked, confused, thinking it was a joke, Marlowe didn't smile, didn't laugh, didn't even blink, just stared until Eli finally nodded and took the paper, which had nothing but a black line drawn through a map of the Grand Central Underground system, and a single word scrawled in shaky ink: 0. Eli had worked the subways for 8 years and had never once heard of track 0, but the access elevator did stop at an unmarked level between B2 and the lower tunnel zone, and out of curiosity and duty, he took the old metal lift down, alone, the lights flickering above him as the elevator groaned its way deeper into the station's ancient bones, until the doors opened with a cold hiss into a tunnel so quiet it made his ears ring, the air thick like wet stone, and the walls covered in soot and rusted steel beams that hadn't been touched in decades, if ever. The strange part was how clean everything was, not new, but untouched. Like time had paused here, with no graffiti, no rats, no trash, just rows of perfectly spaced bolts along the walls and a single track that curved into darkness, unbroken and gleaming faintly under his flashlight. There was a feeling in his chest, small at first, a kind of pressure, like standing underwater. But he brushed it off and walked forward, boots echoing against the old concrete floor, following the line of the track as it gently curved until he saw something that made him stop. A train, silver and sleek, parked silently at the platform that had no number, no signs, no lights, just a single door open like a mouth waiting to be fed. He called out, asking if anyone was there, maybe a stranded inspector or a prank. But there was no answer, and after several minutes, the uneasy feeling returned, stronger now. So he radioed back to base, only to get static, then silence, then a faint voice whispering in a language he didn't understand. And that was when the lights in the tunnel began to dim. Not flicker, but fade. Like something was slowly drinking them. Deciding he needed to check the car and get out fast, he stepped aboard the strange train. And that's when the door slid shut behind him with a final hiss. No button pressed, no warning beep. Just a quiet seal that felt too much like a coffin closing. And the lights inside were soft yellow, buzzing faintly, while the seats were perfectly clean but old. Too old, like something from the 1950s, with worn green leather and brass handles that felt cold to the touch. He moved carefully down the aisle, noting that the advertisements above the windows weren't for products or movies, but instead featured strange diagrams and unreadable symbols, like math from another world, twisting and alive if he stared too long. And when he looked out the window, the train was already moving, slowly. Even though he hadn't felt it begin, the world outside just a blur of stone and tunnel, and then nothing at all. Just black, total black, like the universe had stopped outside and the only place that still existed was this train. Panic crept in slowly, crawling up his spine like ice. But every time he tried to move back to the door, it wasn't there. The layout of the train was changing, slightly at first, like the aisle was longer than before or the windows had more space between them. But then worse, much worse, as the walls began to ripple faintly like fabric in the wind, and strange shapes moved in the reflection of the windows, even though nothing was out there. And then came the sound. Not loud, not sharp, just soft, like breathing, low and deep, as if the train itself was alive and watching. Eli screamed for help, banged on the windows, tried to break the emergency glass, but nothing cracked, nothing responded, and the air grew thick with the smell of copper and old paper. And that was when he realized his watch had stopped, the second hand twitching back and forth between two numbers, never moving forward. And his flashlight flickered into red for a moment before dying completely, even though the batteries were fresh. The lights on the train turned dim blue now, humming with static, and the seats were no longer empty. They were full, each one holding a motionless figure in shadow, wearing clothes from different decades. A man in a World War II uniform, a girl in a 1920s dress, a teenager in a 1990s band shirt. All of them sitting perfectly still, eyes closed, breathing shallow, as if sleeping or worse. And none of them moved when Eli shouted or wept or waved his arms in front of them. The worst part came when he looked in the reflection again and saw himself, only not himself. An older version, gray-haired, skin pale, eyes empty, sitting calmly at the back of the car and smiling at him like he already knew how the story ended. And that's when the conductor appeared at the front of the train, tall and stiff and silent, wearing a perfectly clean black suit with no buttons and no name tag. And instead of a face, there was just a blur, a smudged oval of shadow that made Eli's head ache to look at. And when the conductor began walking toward him, each step slow and heavy, Eli backed away, screaming, begging to leave, to get off, to wake up. But the train just kept moving, faster now, through nothingness, through black tunnels with glowing red symbols flashing by like the train was entering a place that wasn't meant for the living. The conductor reached out with one hand, thin, bony, too many joints, and placed it on Eli's forehead. And in that moment, Eli felt everything. The pain of 1,000 lost people, the cold of deep space, the screams of trapped minds echoing in steel corridors, and the unbearable truth that the train had no destination, only endless movement, forever collecting, forever devouring, forever remembering. And then it all went black. 2 days later, Eli was found wandering the train yard in Jersey, barefoot, bleeding from his nose, eyes sunken, and hair gone completely white, unable to speak, just drawing the same symbol over and over on the floor with his finger, a circle with a line through it. And when the EMTs took him away, he finally whispered one sentence before collapsing into a coma. "There is no track zero, but it knows your name now." It started on a cold, quiet Wednesday night when the train driver, Thomas Granger, took his usual midnight route through the fog-covered valleys just outside the city, a stretch of old railway known for silence and calm, far from the noise and speed of daytime traffic. And he always liked these shifts because they were peaceful. The kind of nights where the only sound was the train wheels humming on the metal tracks and the occasional cry of a far-off owl, with nothing but trees and distant fields under a cloudy sky. Thomas had been driving this line for 14 years, and not once had he experienced anything strange, except for the occasional deer on the tracks, or fog too thick to see clearly. But that night something was different, though he couldn't say what at first. Just a quiet unease that settled in his stomach as he passed Station 13, the one with the broken clock and the ivy-covered signs no one ever repaired. The one where no one ever got on or off because it was no longer in use, officially closed. And yet as the train slowed just slightly past that station, out of habit more than necessity, he thought he saw a figure on the platform, standing perfectly still in the shadows, wearing a dark coat and a brimmed hat, head lowered, as if waiting. Thomas blinked and the figure was gone. No sound, no movement, just the empty station passing by his window. But the feeling didn't leave, and he shook his head, blaming his tired eyes in the fog, and focused again on the route, eyes on the soft glow of the signal lights ahead, hands steady on the controls, until his radio crackled, faintly at first, then clearer, as a voice came through, soft and broken. "Passenger, car 4. And then silence. Thomas frowned, surprised, because the conductor, Mark, never used vague codes like that, and certainly not for something as strange as announcing a passenger without context, especially since this late-night route almost never carried anyone. 3 passengers boarded earlier, 2 got off at Station 9, and only 1 woman was left, seated near the front of car 2. But now the conductor was reporting someone in car 4, which should have been completely empty. Curious and slightly disturbed, Thomas pressed the intercom and called back, asking for confirmation, but got no response, just static. And then a sudden loud thump that echoed through the train like something large had dropped or slammed into the floor. His heart began to beat faster, not panic yet, but tension. Like something was not right, and he reached for the security monitor switch, flipping through each car's feed until he stopped at car 4, and saw someone sitting there, alone, at the far end of the carriage, not moving, body stiff and upright, wearing what looked like a dark, old-fashioned coat with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over the face. Thomas stared, confused, trying to remember if someone had gotten on at the last station, but he was sure no one did, and as he leaned closer to the screen, he noticed something wrong. The figure wasn't breathing, not moving at all, not even a twitch of fingers or a slight shift from the train's motion, just sitting there like a statue, still and wrong. And then the camera began to flicker, warping slightly, and for one brief second, the face lifted toward the lens, and Thomas recoiled in horror, heart slamming in his chest, because the face wasn't right. It was blurred, not from the camera, but as if smeared or burned, with hollow black sockets where eyes should be, and a grin stretched wide and too sharp, lips torn at the corners like the mouth had been opened far too long and far too wide, teeth jagged like broken glass, and then the camera cut to black. Breathing fast now, sweat forming on his forehead. Thomas tried to call Mark again, but the radio was dead, and the lights above the control panel dimmed slightly as the train groaned, something heavy shifting, as if more weight had suddenly entered the back cars. And then footsteps, slow and deliberate, began to echo down the metal corridor from behind, even though the door to the driver's cabin was locked and sealed tight, and he turned, heart pounding, staring at the door window, waiting, listening. But nothing came, only the soft, steady steps that seemed to grow louder and closer, but never reached the door until they stopped completely, and he was left in silence again, broken only by the rattling of the train as it moved deeper into the woods. Desperate, Thomas pulled the emergency brake to stop the train, and it shrieked to a halt, Metal grinding loud into the night, sparks flying, the entire vehicle groaning as it settled onto the track. But when he opened the cabin door and stepped out to check, the corridor was empty. No sign of anyone, no sound, only the cold metal walls and the faint overhead lights flickering as if struggling to stay alive. He moved quickly, passing through car after car, searching for Mark, for the woman, for anyone. But each car was empty, completely silent. No bags, no jackets, nothing, like they had never been there. And when he reached car 4, he stopped cold, staring in disbelief as the temperature dropped around him and the windows steamed from the inside. The passenger was still there, seated at the far end, exactly as before. But now something had changed. The figure was facing him directly, head lifted, though the face was still a blur, and the air around it shimmered faintly, like heat over asphalt. And Thomas called out, trembling, "Sir? Are you all right?" But there was no answer. Only a quiet, low moan like wind through a cave, and then the lights above him popped one by one in a line toward the back, plunging the carriage into darkness. And when he turned to run, the doors slammed shut with a loud bang, trapping him inside. The temperature dropped further, breath misting before his eyes, and from the shadows came movement. Slow, jerking, like broken limbs trying to function again. And then the figure stood, head twitching, shoulders cracking loudly, the hat falling away to reveal not a face, but a deep, endless void, black and swirling like ink. And Thomas stumbled back, screaming, as dozens of cold, invisible hands grabbed at him from the seats, pulling him down, holding him tight as the phantom passenger stepped closer and leaned in, the void where its face should be sucking in the light, the air, the sound, pulling everything into it with a sound like tearing flesh and whispering voices crying from inside a tomb. His screams were cut short as the figure reached out and placed one skeletal hand over his chest, and Thomas felt every memory, every thought, every ounce of life being ripped from him like threads from old cloth, his vision darkening as laughter, high, cruel, echoing, filled the carriage, and then everything went silent. The next morning, the train was found parked gently at the end of the line, empty, powered off, lights dead, no conductor, no passengers, and no driver. Only a faint smudged handprint on the glass of the driver's cabin and one message scratched into the steel wall of car 4 with fingernails. He rides forever. Now they say if you take the midnight train and sit in car 4, you must never sit in the last seat or speak to the man in the hat. Because once you do, he'll know your name, and once he knows your name, he'll never forget it. And someday, somewhere, even years later, you'll hear the low sound of train wheels behind you in the dark, and you'll know your stop has come.